The Florida Keys, 1991. A young woman last seen alive hitchhiking on Valentine's Day. Her body discovered the next day on a deserted road.
This was a perfect place where she had no place to go. She could yell all she want, nobody would hear her, and she never had a chance.
No ID is found at the crime scene. Police give the unidentified young woman a name, Valentine Jane Doe.
Here it happened on Valentine's Day to a young girl, and she'd been sexually assaulted and had been strangled with the strings of her bikini top.
This is the story of how revolutionary forensic science finally identifies both the female victim and her killer after years of frustrating police work. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Bloodline Detectives. February 15, 1991, the Monroe County Sheriff's Office gets an emergency call. A woman's body discovered in the Florida Keys.
The individual that located her body, he at first believed it might have been a male because she was face down. It was fairly fresh. There was not any decomposition or anything like that normally goes on. He went back and got another windsurfer to, I guess, validate what he thought he saw. Back then, we didn't have cell phones. They had to run across the street to actually call authorities to report the crime.
You find a deceased woman, a young lady, clearly had been attacked. So I'm sure for anybody, I don't care what your background is, that's shocking and overwhelming and scary and probably 10 different things going through your mind.
Once major crimes and our detectives and crime scene and the medical examiner and those that are involved in these kind of cases arrive, we systematically start to work the case. So that would involve, first of all, trying to identify her as one, but also looking at what injuries she may have sustained, what does the body look like, is there any other objects or other pieces of evidence within proximity to her body. We look for tire tracks, we look for shoe imprints.
The first thing they notice when they come on the scene, before they see the body, is they immediately identify the telltale signs of a dragging of a body. They see drag marks leading from the road out into this cove area. They take note of this and they write it down in their later reports. When they discover the body, it's naked, it's face down, it has been clearly in a struggle. There are telltale signs of a struggle, of a physical assault.
She did have an injury, a significant injury sustained to her head. There was some abrasions throughout her body. It appeared as though, from the initial observations, that she had some kind of a ligature mark with a piece of clothing around her neck. There was no bra found at the scene, so we believe she was wearing a bikini top, and that was used as a ligature to asphyxiate her. She was somewhat in some form of a tidal pool that was on the side of one of our trails that leads to this horseshoe.
Her clothes are found very close to the body, and she has a red and blue striped sweater. She has these very striking brown moccasins that are not something that people in the Florida Keys usually wear. Typically, you're wearing either sneakers or sandals. And then she was also wearing cut-off jean shorts as well. In a place like the Florida Keys, where there's so little land, it's such a narrow expanse, it's very hard to hide a body. And the perpetrator didn't try to hide it. He just discarded it so he could get away. And he did.
The victim got her name because police had theorized that she had been murdered on Valentine's Day, February 14th, and her body was discovered the following day on February 15th.
We believe her death occurred perhaps in the evening hours or late hours of the 14th. So with her being unknown, it was a way to just use the holiday as a way to recognize her or identify her.
When it comes to clues about what happened, the Monroe County Sheriffs are almost at ground zero. Investigators know very little about the young murder victim. Who was she? How did she end up in this remote location? How did she die? Was she strangled by the piece of clothing found around her neck? Was she strangled there or dumped there? Detectives hope the autopsy will provide answers.
That's when they were really able to get a really good look at the victim and identify key physical descriptions about her. They had determined that it was a white female. She had brown to green eyes, brown hair. And what was also noticeable during the autopsy was that it appeared that she had stretch marks, which also indicated that at some point she may have been pregnant and had carried a baby to full term. They had discovered that she had 2 tattoos. One tattoo was of a cross. She also had a second tattoo with the word love and a heart on the back of her left shoulder. She didn't have any tan lines. This was something that struck investigators because we're talking about Key West, Florida. People in Key West, Florida are spending their days out in the sun, laying out at the beach. So it was very unusual to find this female victim where she didn't have any tan lines. There was no indication that she had spent much time in the sun.
Investigators follow their suspicions. A victim in Key West without a tan line suggests she's not from around there, but guesses alone will not solve this case. Detectives dig deeper. They focus on whether the victim was sex attacked and whether they can retrieve DNA that will identify her.
We'll be taking DNA samples from the victim. We'll be doing fingerprints, clippings from fingernails, trying to get scrapings under nails, scarring, tattoos, try to identify the height, weight, hair, eyes. We'd be looking at samples from a vaginal. For this case, we thought the victim was sexually assaulted. We'd be taking a rape kit, trying to have DNA samples from inside the victim.
Her fingerprints were submitted through our APHIS system or another database, which helps to identify those that have been fingerprinted in the past. Those were inconclusive because, well, it's likely she was never arrested anywhere in the nation. Her information was not populated into the system, so she did not have a fingerprint record on file.
It is very rare for investigators not to be able to determine the identity of a victim. Usually, if it's not immediately found because of readily identifiable information on their person, a wallet, an ID, then it can be determined through their fingerprints, or through their dental records, or through their DNA nowadays. And if that doesn't work, then almost always there are family members or friends who are trying to find where their loved one went. They weren't able to identify this person through any means that they had at the time. And to make it worse, it didn't seem like anyone who really loved her or knew her was trying to find her.
We don't know who she is. We don't know who to notify. We don't know who did this. There were just so many unanswered questions surrounding this that the whole community was just in a state of shock.
Valentine Jane Doe could not be more alone in this world. Sheriffs cannot identify her. No one seems to be looking for her. Is there a single witness that can give a tip and jumpstart this investigation? That's next on Bloodline Detectives. February 15, 1991, one day after Valentine's Day, the naked body of a young woman found murdered in the Florida Keys. Investigators have tried everything they know to identify her. They know from the autopsy she was strangled with her own bikini top. They've run her fingerprints through a national database, but come up empty. For now, police give her the name Valentine Jane Doe. Investigators then release the information to the public, hoping and praying for a lead.
We use Crime Stoppers. We have our own lead system. A lot of these calls come in. They all have to be investigated or vetted somehow. And so there was, yes, hundreds of leads that were starting to come in, and each one had to be individually investigated.
When police appeal to the public for help, it can often be more of a burden than help. Hundreds of tips may pour in from very well-intentioned people, but statistics show these tips seldom pay off. Yet investigators still search for that one good tip, while at the same time, all these tips eat up the investigators' energy. That's the way the public outreach in this case was going until that one tip catches the attention of investigators.
A witness had approached the police and had shared with investigators that they saw a young woman along US Highway 1 hitchhiking the night before, about 18 miles away from where the victim's body was discovered.
The Florida Keys are a linear strip of islands that stretch from the Florida mainland down to Key West. And there is literally one road that connects all of that. So when you talk about the Florida Keys in terms of where you are, in terms of geography, locals use something called a mile marker. That's how they determine where they are. So the victim is seen alive on Valentine's Day in Key West itself, and she's observed to be hitchhiking north. Investigators come across this information because they interview a ton of people. I mean, they interview dozens and dozens of people who see her or may think that they saw her at least. She's seen alive later on in the day at 6:30 at night at mile marker 17, meaning that she is 17 miles north of Key West itself, the southernmost point. So she's heading north, and she's successful in doing so. That's the last time she's seen alive, and her body is found 20 miles away the next day. What happened between 6:30 on Valentine's Day and 8:15 on February 15th, we don't know.
So with her being originally identified as hitchhiking at the 15 and the 17 mile marker, they set up road checks there to try to solicit those that are common to the area. For instance, if you lived in that area, you would traverse in and out of that area quite a bit, and perhaps maybe they would get additional witnesses that may have saw her. So they were trying to get additional witnesses or identify additional witnesses that may have saw her, or perhaps even may have had a conversation with her. At the time, of course, that was unsuccessful as well.
Investigators believe this may be a major break in the case. They hope for more witnesses and more clues, and they focus on a suspicious vehicle seen in the area.
Witnesses had informed police that an older model white pickup truck with a camper had been seen in the area driving along US Highway 1 around February 14th and 15th. But when the police investigated this tip about the pickup truck, nothing really came about.
People thought that maybe, that this was some transient that did this. They found out that the girl was hitchhiking. She was obviously a transient as well, but people didn't know. That was the uncertainty that really kept people very much unsettled about this case. We just didn't know who this was, who the victim was, and who the murderer was. We just didn't know.
What do Monroe County sheriffs really know about Valentine Jane Doe? Well, they know she's been sex assaulted and strangled dead. They know she was last seen 18 miles from where her body's found. They also know no one is looking for her. She's been traveling alone, so investigators reach out to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
The victim's face was so badly bludgeoned that it was not something that the police wanted to release. They released for many, many years no photos of the victim because of that. So they needed to rely on experts in the field of facial reconstruction and animation, really, to come up with a way to release an image of the victim. So they worked with the team at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and they were able to piece together what they thought, a rendering of what they thought the victim looked like.
And when the forensic sketch artist generated this sketch, it was immediately circulated in the media to try and see if anyone out there recognized this woman and might know who she was based on this sketch. But after the sketch was released, the police didn't really receive much. They still weren't any closer to finding out who this woman was.
This is frustrating for them. They want to solve this crime. They want to hold someone accountable. They want to stop potential future attacks. while this person's still free. They want to give closure to the family know where this person is. And when you can't solve a case like this, it wears on you. You drag it with you each and every day. But emotionally, to see the traumatic stuff that we have to see something so heinous, know what this person went through, was brutally attacked and assaulted and sexually assaulted and murdered. You know, it's man, I tell you, it's hard. It's a hard day.
I know they got dozens, perhaps hundreds of leads, and none of them panned out. But that was the only way to find out any information back then, was to try to get the information out, see if anybody knew this person or was reported them missing. And I know the sheriff's office was tireless in this because they felt the same way the community did. They wanted to solve this. They wanted to make sure that people felt secure in their homes, that you didn't have a murderer on the loose out there. It was just a lot of dead ends for the police department and the sheriff's office.
The Monroe County Sheriffs used every investigative technique available in 1991. But nevertheless, the case of Valentine Jane Doe goes cold, and it will take years and brand new forensic technology to bring this case back to life.
For 29 years, the victim, who would become well known in popular media as Valentine Jane Doe, would be unknown, would remain unknown, and it absolutely gnawed on the Monroe Sheriff's Department and the community in the Keys and missing and exploited children advocates all across the country. This was a case that really bothered them.
This was an incredibly sad situation because normally when you're dealing with a homicide victim, you've got a family to send that victim to where they can conduct a proper funeral and a proper burial. But when it comes to this individual, the police didn't know who she was. So instead of sending her body to the family, they kept it in a vault at the morgue until she could be identified and have her remains sent to her family.
The case had gone very cold, obviously, for decades, but it was always there for the sheriff's office. They always were looking for something here. I know it bothered a lot of them. They don't like to have unsolved cases out there, and this was one that bothered many of them for many, many years. But it just grew cold until the detectives said, hey, let's try DNA on this. That was a really up-and-coming technique for law enforcement to go with DNA and eventually try to come to some conclusion as to who this was. This was a new technique and certainly something that they really went for.
And it wasn't until 2020 when advances in forensics technology gave new hope that this case could be solved. So law enforcement agencies, including the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Monroe County, worked together with a private company in seeing if new advances in genetic technology could bring this victim and the perpetrator to light.
Next on Bloodline Detectives, law enforcement joins forces with private companies to solve the case of murdered Valentine Jane Doe. In 2020, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, along with Monroe County Sheriffs, struggled to identify a young woman found sex attacked and murdered 1991. The scene of the crime, a remote area of Key West. Investigators know the victim was last seen alive one day after Valentine's Day. Now, 29 years later, detectives take one last shot to identify her with a brand new forensic technique, genetic genealogy.
When you don't have any new, fresh leads coming in, you're often faced with a roadblock where you've got to come up with a different strategy to try to solve the case. And in this case, that's when the use of forensic genetic genealogy came into play.
We talked about doing some new submissions. We talked about new technology. The director needed me to approve it and signed it. to send it out to FDLE and to get this done and approve the cost and to do it. And I was all about it, because obviously we have to keep up a new technology. We have to do every effort we can to solve these crimes, identify these victims, identify suspects. The chances were lesser than good. They were less likely to be something coming back than they were to come back with a positive hit. But hopeful, we have to be hopeful each and every day, and every event we do and every effort we make, we have to hope that something good comes out of it.
When forensic genealogy came about, they used FDLE as their conduit to, who have a private entity trying to offer law enforcement an opportunity to use their product. So FDLE partnered with Parabon in this case, and were, with our approval, were able to come up with the funds and employ Parabon to do both suspect and victim analysis.
From the crime scene, they were able to find foreign DNA, and that DNA was from a male that they believed was responsible for her murder. So that's the DNA that was submitted to Parabon for us to develop a SNP profile and then perform investigative genetic genealogy on. Lori Napolitano was the former lead of the investigative genetic genealogy unit at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And we worked together on many cases. On this case, because it was a two-pronged approach with two separate investigative genetic genealogy cases, she took the case and the work of trying to identify the victim, while I focused on trying to identify her killer. This case was unique because we didn't know the identity of the victim. So that's very unusual, to be trying to help bring justice to somebody who I don't even know who they are. I don't know who their family members are. I don't know who I'm trying to find answers for. So it doesn't make it any less compelling. In fact, in some ways, it almost makes it more compelling because we have multiple mysteries. I'm exclusively focused on trying to bring answers and justice for that victim. I don't know her name, but I know she's Valentine Jane Doe, and that's enough for me to really drive me to try to identify her killer.
Now, what's so incredible about this technology, and this is where it really gets into science fiction, at least from my untrained eye, investigators and researchers are able to cross-reference DNA with public accessible databases of DNA. So these are the type of things that you and I do when we try to find out what country our relatives are from. All that is put in a big pool. And so they can look at that information and try to find out victims and perpetrators of crimes. And in this case, that's exactly what they did.
I was aware of where Valentine Jane Doe was found and when, and so I knew that her killer had to be in that area at that time and of the right age to have perpetrated this crime. From the DNA, we knew that he was male. And so I was looking for a male of the right age. Didn't know if he was young or old, but of an age where he wasn't too young or too old to be able to perpetrate this crime. And I knew it was somebody that had to be in the area where she was found around the time that she was discovered. Working with the DNA of the unknown suspect, as I do on all my cases, I create genetic networks. I compare those top matches to some of the more distant matches and try to find clusters of matches that are sharing DNA with each other. Then I build their trees and I try to identify their common ancestors. If I'm successful in doing that, then I can piece his family tree back together, piece by piece by piece. It's like a puzzle. I have to find that one person or that set of siblings that is related to all of those top or key matches. And so if we have matches that share X DNA in addition to the autosomal DNA, we know those matches are going to connect to that male's mother's side. And so that helped me because typically you don't know which side is mom's side and which side is dad's side. And you're just moving the pieces around until they all fit. You try to find all the descendants of a set of common ancestors. So in this case, I was able to find that union couple between two of the genetic networks. So that is very exciting. When those pieces start falling in place, it's a very exciting moment in my job because I know I'm heading in the right direction.
Parabon was able to identify one name as the lead suspect in this case. That was Robert Lynn Bradley. That information was cross-referenced from DNA found at the scene, semen, and other DNA that was held by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Interestingly enough about Robert Lynn Bradley was that he was dead. And in fact, he had been shot dead, murdered, about a year after this killing.
We do know when we are able to identify him from Texas, at the time of his death, he had a piece of paper on him, and that piece of paper was a receipt of where he stayed in Miami at a homeless shelter. That document or that receipt is dated in November of 1990, which is about 4 months or so or less leading up to her case. So we know that he is at least in Miami months prior to this case. Whether he traveled up and down the Keys or not, or he actually was in the Keys working or not, what he was doing down here, I have no idea. But when he saw the opportunity with this case, he obviously took it. This may have been his first one, but it also might not have been. Usually in these kind of cases where these are crimes of opportunity and deviancy and sexual assault, this is something that may have happened prior to, and likely, possibly, unfortunately, may have happened thereafter. I read the case and what he allegedly did in 1988 to this lady in California, and it had a lot of the same characteristics that were shown in our case as well. The strangulation, the abusement from a male to a female, that kind of thing. So very, very highly possible that he may have committed a crime like this, or would have continued to commit crimes like this.
This was a violent, selfish act to just randomly just rape this woman and not care about her. And then the day was make sure that he either didn't get caught or during the course of a struggle to subdue her. But this is a person that had no caring for this woman or whatever. She was nothing. She was a piece of trash to him that he just used and discarded like garbage. Here's a person who has caring for nobody but himself, a person who had nothing going good for himself in life. He bobbed around different areas, moving from here to there, and his violent history here, prior and after, being shot down, murdered, and killed, tells you this was just a terrible person, would do nothing for anybody, and is just a low-life piece of garbage that is where he needs to be.
Now that the lab has identified a promising suspect, the first thing that investigators need to do is to make sure that this is their guy. They need to be able to compare his DNA profile to the DNA collected at the crime scene. That's when they realized that because he had died in 1992, they were able to reach out to the morgue, the coroners, to obtain a sample of his DNA from his autopsy.
Luckily, they still maintain a bloodstain card that was submitted by the medical examiner. We were able to take that bloodstain card that they sent to us and have that compared to the DNA sample that we had. So FDLE Crime Lab went ahead and compared both samples from the DNA swabs with that of the bloodstain card that was submitted by Texas.
They were able to match the DNA collected at the crime scene to the DNA that was collected at his autopsy, and when the two samples were compared, they came back as a match.
The identification of Valentine Jane Doe's killer is a huge breakthrough for Bloodline Detectives, but that's only half the story. They're determined to give Valentine Jane Doe her real name and restore her past life after almost 30 years.
Now that investigators had identified a suspect, the next thing that they needed to do was figure out who their victim was. And using very similar DNA testing and technology, they were able to identify this female victim.
The investigations that Lori Napolitano and I were performing were in parallel. So she was working with the DNA matches for the unidentified victim, while I was working with the DNA matches for the unidentified suspect. And we were off, siloed, doing our own thing. And so I wasn't aware of the identity of the victim until I had identified the potential perpetrator. Once Lori Napolitano and her team at FDLE was able to make a positive identification, they shared with me that they believed Valentine Jane Doe was Wanda Kirkham.
Something that took over 29 years came to them in an instant. The name of the victim was Wanda D. Kirkham. Finally, after nearly 3 decades, her identity was known.
Nearly 30 years go by, and then, in a single instant, a female victim who has been so alone, without even a name, now has a real name and a real life story to go with it. That's next on Bloodline Detectives. For nearly 30 years, Florida investigators called her Valentine Jane Doe, the victim of a violent sex attack and murder in Key West. Now they have her real name, Wanda Kirkham, and the task of locating any relatives to determine how the teen girl Wanda Kirkham ended up in Key West.
We were able to identify a family member that lived close to where we are in Florida. That family member was in Spring Hill, Florida. So we were able to get an interview with her, and she certainly confirmed that yes, she was the sister of Edith Rogers Kirkham, who had somewhat of an estranged relationship with her sister, and eventually recognized that her sister had left California many years ago and moved to New York with a man, and they believed that they both had a child by the name of Wanda Kirkham.
Although Wanda's parents had already passed away, investigators were able to track down an aunt of Wanda's who provided investigators with a picture of Wanda. And when investigators looked at the picture and compared it to their victim, it was a match.
Who was Wanda Kirkham? Well, it turned out that she was from Western New York. She ran away from home when she was 16 years old. Doesn't seem like she had a very good relationship with her family. Her parents are both dead now, and there wasn't really much family left from Wanda. And at the time of her disappearance, her family allegedly were abusive and never even reported her missing.
After the police had identified Wanda, they were able to track down one of her cousins, a cousin that grew up with Wanda. And investigators spoke with her to find out more about their victim, Wanda. And what the cousin had shared with investigators, that there were some very serious allegations made that Wanda's parents had been abusive towards her.
So this cousin, apparently, from what she said, spent some childhood time with Wanda, growing up in upstate New York. They would occasionally have visits with family members and whatnot. And she asserted that Wanda might have had a troubled childhood, a very dysfunctional family with both her parents. We understood that she did run away probably around the age of 15 to 16 years old. And that unfortunately, and this was also challenging to the initial detectives, this is a child at 15 or 16 years old that was never actually reported as a missing person.
I think that Wanda was out along US Highway 1. I think that he came along, he saw her hitchhiking along the side of the road. He saw his opportunity. He decided to possibly befriend her, offer her a ride. Once she got into his car, that's when he assaulted her.
Next on Bloodline Detectives, how science and old school police work team up to finally paint a portrait of a tragic young girl. The science used to identify Wanda Kirkham after nearly 30 years is extraordinary. Just as extraordinary is the teamwork between the forensic scientists at Parabon Labs and, in this case, Florida law enforcement. Together, they complete the picture of a life cut short.
But there's so much more we don't know about her, and that's the frustrating part about this case. She had gotten a tattoo, had the word love in it, and a heart, And this is a person who didn't seem to get a whole lot of love at home. And yet, she had it tattooed on her body. So she was seeking it. She had a sense of fashion, was trying to find her way in life. She clearly needed help. She needed support. She was a very trusting person. So many people have gone to the Florida Keys to reinvent themselves. And maybe that's what she was trying to do too.
The announcement that this case was finally solved, that the victim had finally been identified, as well as her killer, this was huge for the community. The community had waited years and years for this case to be solved, and finally, with the use of forensic genetic genealogy, they finally had the answers they spent years searching for.
That was some great foresight by the Monroe County Sheriff's Office and their detectives to preserve all of that evidence, to preserve the blood evidence from both the victim and the perpetrator. And they had no idea of knowing at the time that this evidence would eventually lead to both the victim and the killer and their identities.
There's no doubt this is 100% the reason we solved this case. Without that, we would still have an unsolved murder, still trying to identify the victim, the suspect, and still have a case sitting on the shelf. So there's no question that this is what broke the case. Obviously, the hard work of men and women in the Sheriff's Office moving forward, trying to keep up with technologies and submissions. But at the end of the day, without this technology, this and many other cases now in the future would never be solved.
It was a real team effort between FDLE, Parabon, and the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. And we each played really important roles in this. It was wonderful collaborating with Lori Napolitano, splitting our casework the way that we did. I think it makes the work that FDLE is doing in Florida much more efficient because we can work together. They have their strengths, we have our strengths. They have access to records we don't. And so I really love the partnership that we have, and I think it's a great model for the rest of the country. I wish all 50 states had a program like Florida does. It can really help bring these cases to resolutions more quickly and more efficiently.
This was huge. We were very proud of our teams. We did press releases and made sure the media knew about it. We want to encourage other agencies to see how successful it was for us, that maybe they have a cold case, they may try this technology. So we want to spread the good word that, look, this is out there. We used it. It's successful. We closed this case. There's a reason to continue, even 20 years later, to work on cold cases, to try to solve these cases, that they can be solved, or even the detectives who are no longer work here, who worked in that case years ago, can maybe feel some closure in themselves. They held this for 20 years, these initial detectives and people, and even ones that worked on it after that, they struggled with this on that they couldn't close it, they couldn't solve it, they couldn't get closure, they couldn't hold someone accountable. We're happy to tell those people involved. They're excited, and so they got a million questions, and they're just so happy because this is the one case they couldn't close, they couldn't solve. Now it's solved. So for them, it's closure. They take these, like we said earlier, personal. They can relate to this being their daughter, their sister, their cousin, a family relative, a friend, someone they grew up with. And this, for them, I think is just a little bit of relief for them. While we wish that it would never occurred, we wish we could have held this person accountable. We wish we could have arrested him before he got killed and have him sit the rest of life in prison. But again, the fact that at least he was murdered a year later, at least his act of terror on women and other people has come to an end.
I think it's always disturbing when somebody dies without an identity. There is a dignity that I believe we all deserve. We all deserve to have an identification in life and in death, to know who we are, for people to know who we are. And so it's a real indignity and injustice to me when somebody has died and they are listed as a Jane or John Doe. Nobody deserves that. Everybody deserves an identity. It is a silent epidemic in this country. I think people are becoming more aware of it, but there are tens of thousands of Jane and John Does across the country. Investigative genetic genealogy has the capability to bring names back to these individuals, to provide their identities, and to bring answers to their families and loved ones about what happened to them. But we've got to work it case by case by case. and there are a lot of cases out there, there is the real potential that we can identify all of these people like Valentine Jane Doe, but we need the funding, we need the interest from the public to participate, to upload their DNA to GEDmatch and allow us to compare that against these nameless individuals so we can help them regain their names and their identities.
The more that everyone's DNA is shared, the more cases like Wanda Kirkham's can be solved, and the more a tragic young life lost, even to her own family, can find dignity again. I'm Nancy Grace. Thank you for joining us here on Bloodline Detectives.